This is the CBS Evening News. Bob Schieffer reporting. Good evening. There is an end tonight to the bizarre hijacking that began in the Soviet Union 2 days ago with the seizing of a busload of school children. The hijackers exchanged their young hostages for a huge ransom, you'll recall, and a plane, which then flew them to Israel. Well, tonight, 24 hours later, the hijackers were flown home to face the music. Bob Simon in Israel has our report.
It was as if Moscow was now sending daily flights to Tel Aviv. The Tupolev 154 came in this afternoon carrying 19 Soviet security people and doctors. Meanwhile, the object of their visit, the 4 hijackers, were spending their day in a Tel Aviv jail. Israel TV reported that when they arrived yesterday, they offered Israeli officials $1 million, that's half of the loot, for the right to stay. The offer was refused. After a day in a Tel Aviv hotel, the crew of the hijacked plane boarded a bus tonight to return to the airport. The hijackers came out in other vehicles. Under heavy police escort and wearing Israeli handcuffs, they were handed over one by one to the Soviet security men who brought them quickly onto the plane. An Israeli foreign ministry official told CBS News that Jerusalem only agreed to hand them over when Moscow gave a written assurance that they would not be hung. Air piracy is a capital crime in the Soviet Union. To circumvent the lengthy extradition process, they were deported as illegal aliens, simply as people who had arrived without a visa. Legally, it's as if they'd never been here at all. The Israelis now feel that the Soviets owe them one, and they'd very much like to see the debt repaid with more flights to Israel full of Soviet Jews. Before takeoff, bags of money were brought on board. Foreign Minister Shimon Peres said he hoped Israel's handling of the incident would lead to greater understanding between the two countries. Air traffic control seemed to agree.
It was a pleasure for us to assist you and hope to hear from you soon.
Bob Simon, CBS News, Ben Gurion Airport.
For those 30 Soviet school children taken hostage by the hijackers Thursday, it was a terrifying experience. For Soviet television viewers, official coverage of the incident was a novel experience. And Barry Peterson in Moscow has that.
It was a story of frightened children and terror, made all the more extraordinary for being told on Soviet television, where news of even ordinary crime and violence within this country was once forbidden. The Soviet reporter held up shell casings, saying that during the 22-hour ordeal, the hijackers fired into the air. At another point, they exchanged 5 children for narcotics. We were told if we panicked, said one child, something awful would happen to us. It was terrifying, their teacher said. Any wrong move could have started them shooting. At one point, the reporter turned to the children and asked, was it horrible? This KGB officer offered himself in exchange for the children. The hijackers eventually settled for a ransom worth more than $3 million. And just as extraordinary today, Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze called in the head of a low-level Israeli delegation to thank Israel, and that was shown on TV as well. The two countries broke off relations after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Arya Levine told CBS News Tonight this recognition of his group by the Soviet Union's top diplomat could help speed the restoration of diplomatic relations. As to why the Soviets were willing to deal with the hijacker and later tell their own people so much of the story, there may be an answer in an old Russian proverb that says, nothing is worth the blood of an innocent child. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Moscow.
Just 7 weeks now left in Ronald Reagan's presidency, but there's still one more big event on the agenda, one last round of superpower diplomacy, and the president said today he's looking forward to it. White House correspondent Terrence Smith reports.
President Reagan's schedule these days is filled for the most part with farewell dinners. But this weekend, he's closeted at Camp David, preparing for his 5th and final meeting next week with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Mr. Reagan shared some of his feelings about the occasion in his weekly radio address.
I must admit that I would not have predicted after first taking office that someday I would be waxing nostalgic about my meetings with Soviet leaders. But here we are.
Governor's Island in New York Harbor will be the setting Wednesday when the two leaders, joined by President-elect Bush, will meet for lunch. Even Democrats on Capitol Hill said today that the three-way encounter will serve a worthwhile purpose.
I think this meeting will be a sort of transition meeting where Ronald Reagan will say, Here is my successor. Here is the person who will lead the American people. This is the person you've got to come to know, you've got to learn to deal with, and it will be an introductory session.
The U.S. side says it has no major new proposals to put on the table. But what if the Russians do?
I think we would be prepared to deal with any surprise that they might come up with.
Perhaps, but surprise has been a favorite Gorbachev technique at unstructured meetings, like the hastily arranged summit in Iceland in 1986, when he suddenly proposed the elimination of all nuclear weapons. U.S. officials don't expect anything that sweeping at Governor's Island, but they'll be on their guard nonetheless. Terrence Smith, CBS News, the White House.
And still ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, the latest on the Space Shuttle's mystery mission, and later the California earthquake that caused more talk than trouble.
How will you live in the next century? Suddenly, life will be more comfortable, smoother, and quicker. Introducing the new 1989 Buick Century, with premium features you expect from the best-selling Buick on the American road. All at a price that will let you enter the next century very comfortably. Save up to $1,500 on Century with $500 cash back and option packages.
The Remington microscreen shaves as close as a blade, or your money back. The first screen shaves incredibly close, the second even closer. The Remington microscreen shaves as close as a blade, or your money back.
And the Lady Remington rechargeable, the perfect gift.
Gas pain, bloating. Gas-X has the strongest, fastest relief ingredient. Painful gas is like beer bubbles. Add the leading antacid. Add Gas-X. Only Gas-X gets rid of the gas. The strongest, fastest reliever for gas pain and bloating. Gas-X.
Welcome to a room unlike any you've ever seen. A room where the light comes on automatically when you enter, then goes off when you leave. Where you never have to flip a switch, pull a string, or wish you had an extra hand. Every room could be this convenient if you add a First Alert sensor switch. It automatically turns the lights in any room on and off. Sensor switch from First Alert. Isn't there room for one in your home? Look for the complete sensor switch line.
Officials in Bangladesh said today the final death toll from this week's devastating cyclone and tidal wave may reach 10,000. The known toll so far is 1,500. Thousands of cattle also died. Vast areas of rice and other crops were destroyed. That same part of the country, part of the world, in her first official act as Pakistan's new Prime Minister, Benazir Bhutto, today granted amnesty to about 1,000 political prisoners and commuted all death sentences. In this country, an earthquake struck Pasadena, California today. It was felt for miles around, but only minor injuries are reported and not much damage. We have a report from Jerry Bowen.
The pre-dawn quake jolted millions of people awake across Southern California.
I woke up and I said, this is a big one, and I laid there paralyzed. I didn't move.
It was like frightening. It was like a big hand being put on our building and shaking us. Terrifying.
But the Timbler, measuring an even 5 on the Richter scale, was extraordinary because it caused so little damage, only briefly knocked out power to 100,000 people and resulted in no serious injuries. The worst case was a man who shot himself in the leg when he mistook the quake for an intruder.
For an earthquake this size and this magnitude, we would have expected more damage.
It's interesting that other earthquakes of this same size elsewhere in the world have sometimes been very damaging because construction practices are just not nearly as good in many places as they are generally here in Southern California.
The epicenter of the quake was originally thought to have been under the Rose Bowl, which sustained no damage, but scientists say now that it was more likely located nearby under downtown Pasadena. The shaker, which lasted roughly 20 seconds, could be felt over a 15,000 square mile area covering 6 counties, and there were several minor aftershocks. Because the quake was so deep, an estimated 10 miles beneath the surface, scientists may never be able to pinpoint its location. This morning's quake was 1/10 the magnitude of the nearby 1987 Whittier shaker, which killed 8 people and caused $360 million damage. Scientists say there's only a remote chance that a bigger quake may follow today's.
About 2 to 5% of the earthquakes that we pick up are followed by larger earthquakes within a 1-week period of time.
Still, in quake country, life has a way of quickly getting back to normal. Only hours after the shaker, volunteers were busy decorating floats for the annual Rose Parade which moves down Pasadena streets that were moving on their own earlier today. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
And at sundown today, Jews around the world begin celebrating Hanukkah. The 8-day festival of lights commemorates the rededication of the ancient temple in Jerusalem.
Believe it or not, these 3 prunes have more fiber than this entire bowl of bran flakes. Prunes, the high-fiber fruit.
When my arthritis pain acts up, even little things are a big effort. But I don't take aspirin anymore. I take Advil. Advil is the brand many doctors recommend for hours of relief from minor arthritis pain. You know, just 1 Advil is as effective as 2 regular aspirin. And Advil doesn't upset my stomach the way aspirin sometimes can. So now, I don't even have to think about arthritis. Advil, tablets and caplets, advanced medicine for pain.
Feel your oats. Post. Oats, oats. Feel your oats with new Post Oat Flakes. Golden toasted flakes with whole grain oat nutrition and whole grain oat taste. Feel your oats with new Post Oat Flakes.
Morning,
This
Joanne.
one was approved, yes?
Right, and Steve knows about the change. The exclusion of the top 10.
This is my husband, Michael. He's under a lot of pressure, but now he's doing things differently. Like taking the stairs, eating more fruit, and cutting down on cholesterol and saturated fat. That's why I cook the foods he loves with Puritan oil. Puritan has no cholesterol and is 94% saturated fat-free. I've got an idea.
The health club before dinner. Great.
Michael is feeling wonderful. And I am too.
Puritan. Make it your oil for life.
Problems are already piling up for soon-to-be President George Bush, none bigger than the budget deficit. To cut it down, he may have to cut some planned armaments or politically sensitive issues, as Pentagon correspondent David Martin reports.
The Midget Man mobile missile, the Osprey vertical takeoff and landing plane, a new nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. All weapons for the 21st century, all weapons which may not survive the coming budget crunch at the Pentagon. Canceling a big-ticket weapons program before it goes into production may be the only way the Bush administration can make the defense spending cuts needed in the battle against the deficit.
It's definitely hard to cancel a weapon system once it goes into full-rate production. Politically, it becomes very difficult because local economies begin to depend on it. Contracts are let. It's very expensive to cancel contracts sometimes. People's jobs begin to depend on the program. And it's just too much momentum behind the program.
Take the new stealth bomber. Estimated cost, $68 billion for 132 airplanes. Canceling it now would go a long way toward meeting the estimated $116 billion in cuts the Defense Department will have to make over the next 5 years. But what would it mean for the tiny aerospace town of Palmdale, California, where the bomber is made?
Palmdale is used to the ups and downs of the military, but this program is critically important to our economy.
And not just Palmdale. Thousands of workers nationwide signed this scroll proclaiming their work on the stealth project.
Men and women all over the country have been able to join together in this extraordinary effort.
It's no accident stealth contracts are spread all over the country. The Pentagon does it to maximize political support for expensive weapons. But one congressman is worried that won't be enough to save his community when the budget cutters put on their green eye shades.
People who live and work around the Potomac really could care less about a local community. They indeed are looking at the world, they think, and economic circumstances at the local level play a very insignificant role.
Cutting the defense budget will hurt local communities. Failing to rein in the federal deficit could damage the nation. It's a classic Hobson's choice in which there are no good alternatives. And it may be the most lasting legacy of the Reagan arms buildup. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
And joining us now for our Washington Notebook section, someone who knows a lot about both the Pentagon and the Soviet Union, Richard Pearl, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, who's been a key player for years in Washington on dealings with the Soviet Union, arms control, and Pentagon spending, for that matter. Mr. Pearl, you heard that report. Everywhere you go, people are saying the Pentagon budget is going to have to take some deep cuts. Do you fear that it may go too far?
I certainly do. There have already been deep cuts, of course, from the projections of just a few years ago. And I think the budgets that have been prepared last year and for next year are about the minimum that's consistent with our security.
But can George Bush put through a budget like that without raising taxes?
Well, he's going to have a problem on the Hill. There's no question that Congress is almost bound to cut any budget that he sends forward. But it's already the case that an optimistic budget from the Defense Department point of view would entail only 2% growth in defense, and that's well below what the outgoing Carter administration thought would be necessary.
Well, how did that come to pass, that Ronald Reagan builds up the budget, and now George Bush says we shouldn't have Michael Dukakis coming in there, and all of a sudden it looks like you're going to have a budget that is less than Jimmy Carter proposed? What's happened here?
Well, I think the defense budget in some ways has become a bit of a whipping boy. We're spending about 6.5% of our gross national product on defense. The other 93.5% is spent on other purposes, public and private. And to expect that modest percentage of our national wealth to solve the problem of the deficit is unrealistic, and it burdens our security.
Let me turn to another issue. Mr. Gorbachev comes to town next week at a time when a lot of people in this country are saying that the United States ought to encourage Mr. Gorbachev in his perestroika, the so-called new openness in the Soviet Union. You wrote an article this week that has stirred up a little controversy, saying that this is a time the United States ought to tighten credit on the Soviet Union. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, we want to see the Soviets make some pretty fundamental changes, and hopefully Mr. Gorbachev wants to make those changes too. And the most obvious is reordering their priorities. They are spending now about a quarter of their gross national product on the military, 4 times what we're spending. And the Soviet Union is a relatively poor country. If they're going to finance reforms, as I think they must, they have to turn to that defense budget as one of the ways of doing it. If we come along and lend them what they need to avoid those painful choices, then just at the moment that we're cutting our budget, because we have to face tough choices, we will help them escape cutting their budget, and that doesn't make any sense.
So what you're saying is we should tell them, cut your military spending, or we're not going to help you finance some of these things that you need loans from the West on.
Absolutely. If we're going to give them help, I think we have a right to ask them to spend less on the military, which would permit us to spend less on the military.
What do you think is going to happen when Mr. Gorbachev comes next week? Do you expect him to unveil some new surprise proposals like he did at Iceland?
Well, I was at Iceland, and of course you never quite know what to expect. I would hope that the administration has at least a tacit understanding that there will be no surprises. But if there are surprises, I would hope that the outgoing president and the incoming president would understand that you can't put together sensible, lasting agreements over lunch. It's just more difficult than that.
So if something new happens, take it under advisement, say thank you, and go on to something else.
That's right. Take some time and think it through.
Thank you, Mr. Pearl.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more news in just a minute. Argentina's President Raul Alfonsín cut short his U.S. visit and returned home today to cope with another army rebellion. About 400 rebel soldiers in Buenos Aires are demanding amnesty for officers charged with human rights abuses during the recent military regime. Voters in Venezuela elect a new president tomorrow. With oil prices still depressed, the leading candidate says he will demand easier repayment terms for Venezuela's huge foreign debt, much of it owed to American banks. Juan Vasquez with that.
The focus of the Venezuelan election is the political comeback of former President Carlos Andrés Pérez, a 66-year-old populist. He's been drawing huge crowds with a campaign that blames the country's $35 billion foreign debt for Venezuela's economic problems. As living standards throughout the region fall, that theme has growing political appeal.
It has become highly politicized in Latin America, and the majority of the population would like something to be done about it. Obviously, the politicians in power will blame the U.S., the industrial countries, and the foreign banks.
Up to now, Venezuela has been the sort of Latin American country that Washington loves. Prosperous, peaceful, friendly. Those days may be over soon. Like most countries that depend on oil production, Venezuela's economy is in trouble. Its standard of living is declining.
Basically, political trends in Latin America are veering towards the left as a reaction to the standard of living problems in many of the countries due to the problems in servicing debt.
That's one reason that Eduardo Fernández is having trouble getting his moderate political message across, although there is little either candidate can do about the drying up of oil revenues, most of which goes to pay interest on the debt. The solution favored by Pérez and other politicians in the region is to demand lower interest payments. such policies are not expected to make Washington very happy, but pollsters say Perez is so far ahead in Venezuela that the only question is how wide his margin of victory will be. Juan Vasquez, CBS News, Miami.
Soviet Union and Afghan rebels today opened their highest level talks yet on ending the war and exchanging POWs. The top deputy Soviet foreign minister and rebel leaders are meeting in Saudi Arabia. The Polish government told Solidarity founder Lech Wałęsa today that he is free to travel to Paris next week for a human rights celebration. It'll be the first trip outside Poland since Solidarity was banned 7 years ago. Well, this is day 2 of the Space Shuttle's military mission. Because it is a military mission, NASA's not saying what the Atlantis astronauts did up there today, but what they were scheduled to do is the worst-kept secret on Earth. Bruce Hall with that.
The unusual northeast departure path from the Kennedy Space Center indicates Atlantis is in an extremely high orbit that takes the shuttle over Moscow and the Soviet Union. The astronauts' secret flight plan called for a clandestine release of a huge spy satellite today. But so far, no private tracking stations have reported picking up the highly sophisticated spy in the sky. The satellite is supposed to provide an all-weather radar imagery of targets and military movements in the Soviet Union. A smaller system was tested from the shuttle in 1984, providing these modest images. The new satellite, codenamed La Crosse, should have much greater detail. Former U.S. arms negotiator Paul Warnke says the satellites will also help prevent military confrontations.
Oh, they're very definitely a deterrent. Because what they do is make it very clear that if there's any sort of an effort at a surprise attack, that effort is far less likely to succeed.
Some space policy analysts are hoping the military will drop their veil of secrecy over the La Crosse program so the public can better understand how spy satellites can help keep world peace.
They reduce suspicions of hostile intentions among nations and also enhance arms control verification. So it's important for the public to understand the function of these satellites.
Late this afternoon, the burned-out solid rocket boosters were towed back to Port Canaveral in Florida. Engineers want to inspect the O-ring seals to make certain the new design installed after the Challenger accident is working properly and will prevent another accident. Bruce Hall, CBS News, Johnson Space Center.
Men, they lost their lives this week in an explosion blamed on arsonists. Gary Reeves reports.
Firefighters came from all over the nation, and citizens came by the hundreds to Kansas City's Arrowhead Stadium to remember the 6 firefighters who died in Tuesday's tragic explosion.
We must commit ourselves as part of their legacy to ensure that such an event never occurs again.
These were 6 gentlemen that died. Don't know them, never heard of them. They're my brothers.
The 6 firefighters were killed at a construction site when a fire triggered 2 blasts of ammonium nitrate that leveled their fire trucks and broke windows 10 miles away. It literally shook the city. Thousands shared in the tragedy.
I think that firemen are very important, and they gave their lives.
Go out and you do your job, and you never know when you're going to come back or not.
Police believe an arsonist touched off the blast and have offered a $35,000 reward to help catch him. More than $40,000 has been collected for the firefighters' families. But today's service may mean more than money.
The outpouring of public sentiment for our fallen brothers has moved every firefighter in every station in this community and across the United States.
It's got my heart doing flip-flops. It really does.
Kansas City is no small town, but today it reacted like one, as citizens and firefighters vowed never to forget the 6 who died answering their last alarm. Gary Reeves, CBS News, Kansas City.
And that's the news. Susan Spencer will be here tomorrow. Later tonight on West 57th, Meredith Vieira profiles the main characters in the Tawana Brawley case. I'm Bob Schieffer, CBS News in New York.
playoff-hungry Saints atop the NFC West and out to stall the wild card hopes of the Vikings tomorrow on CBS Sports.
This is CBS.